correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if there's any of those super intense Kirby. Well, not Stan haters. I mean, everybody loves Kirby. How can you not love Jack Kirby? I say the most intense Stan haters have never worked in a staff position at a comic book company. You know, um,
Or
because
in corporate, actually,
or
I
in
would
corp.
say.
Got it.
Welcome back to the Comics Cube, everyone. Today we're back with with Danny Fingeroth, and we are talking Stan Lee, A Marvelous Life. Or is it
Yes,
A
you got.
Marvelous Life? The Amazing Story of Stan Lee.
Thank you. And you got a well worn paperback there. I'm sure you'll ask me questions about stuff I don't remember, but what the
Well,
hell?
let's talk about some overarching theme in this book because I keep
Okay.
reading this with the context of somebody who's own of course was not around back then and everything.
Right.
And one of the things that struck me, and I wanted to ask you, was in all of your contact with Stan, all of your interviews with him, uh, did he ever strike you as somebody with a high level of insecurity? Because I kind of feel like there's some anxiety going on there. His compliments are always, a lot of the time, are backhanded, qualified.
Um, yeah, I think insecurity defined his life. I mean, that really, yeah. I mean, not a hint of it or a touch of it. I mean, I think it was, um, yeah, a very core part of his personality and his whole life story.
Was it because I was gonna go with the fear of failure for that as well. Like I feel like he was not he was scared. Well, I don't know about scared, but I feel like the reason it came off to me that he stayed in comics for such a long time was because he a part of it was that it was safe, but also a part of it was that he didn't want to leave it without accomplishing everything that he wanted to accomplish within the context of it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Well, look, he was. I mean, it's it's such a cliche. He was complicated. Everybody's complicated. Um, I think. you know.
Feels like
Uh,
Steve Ditko was a pretty straightforward person.
I mean, that's only because we didn't see much of him, right? I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure that to those who knew him, Steve was probably more than than the simply defined caricature we may have of that he had these rigid. Okay, that's another. Although it fits in with Stan actually. Um, yeah, well, he had look. He came from a very poor home. I think he had some relatives who would occasionally, help them out. That's how I guess he got that bicycle, and there was some sinus surgery. So I mean, but basically, very poor kid with a father who was often out of work, and not just during the Depression. I think his father, was very difficult to get along with, so he found himself out of work a lot. And it was the Depression. He was born, in 22. The Depression lasts from basically, 1929 to 1940 or so when when the war started. So he had this secure job starting when he was 17 or 18 years old. Yeah, it's tough, for someone with that background to leave a comfortable position. I mean, this is something I've really figured out both writing the book and since this extremely complicated relationship with Martin Goodman, with the publisher who was his cousin by marriage. Um, but he had a secure position even when the company imploded. And yeah, it's tough. It's tough to leave. He had I don't know if he had a great salary, but he had a decent salary, and he could supplement it by signing himself as much freelance writing as he wanted. Again, at pretty lousy rates as the comic book industry pays, but if he could do it in volume. So he had he had, a nice suburban middle class, maybe even upper middle class lifestyle, that he didn't want to lose. But he also had ambitions. He had a vision of himself that maybe he could take this unexpected phenomenon of Marvel, right? In 1950, 1961, Marvel is just, which didn't even have a name then. Nobody even really, people mostly called it Goodman's Company or Stan Lee's company. There was no, it had that little MC on the cover,
Yeah.
which Roy Thomas has told me nobody's ever really confirmed stood for Marvel Comics. Everybody assumes it did. you know.
Maybe it was
Uh,
Martin Comics.
yeah, it could be Martin Comics. It could be, I don't know, Monday Comics. That's when to put them out on the rack for the retailers. Who knows, right? Um, so yeah, right, 1961, Fantastic Four comes out in the summer, and it builds, and they add the characters, and by a year or two later, there's this kind of phenomenon, and I think that of course now is capital M, capital A, capital R, capital V, capital E, capital L, Marvel. Um, yeah, so I think he thought that he could somehow use that to catapult himself into, specifically into Hollywood. I mean, I guess, well, I'll end the answer there, because that might have been a longer answer than
But the
that question.
craziest thing was if he was meaning to catapult himself into Hollywood with it. The ironic thing is, by the time he passed away, Marvel was the biggest thing in Hollywood.
It was, and he was too. He had built this Stanley brand. But then the thing, there's all this sort of office politics too, because as Marvel peaks, Goodman, who'd been through, like Stan, like everybody had been through these peaks and valleys in the comic business, sells the company. And Stan, interestingly, takes that opportunity not to go to Hollywood, but to maneuver himself into the position as publisher. So I guess this is all still building, in the back of his mind. Right now, he's just still thinking, huh, I made, I built this thing, with Kirby, with Ditko, with Goodman, with everybody. I built this Marvel thing. Um, why don't I become the boss of it? It's interesting. I mean, just so it's like the first instinct was not I'm going to Hollywood. It took a while, I guess, for that to gel, for him to really even think about, how to get out there, because his instinct was Martin's leaving. I'm going to be publisher. Oh, look, Martin has got a commitment from Cadence, the company that bought Marvel, to put his son Chip in as publisher, and so it became, I mean, it's funny. I wrote the book, and I've read obviously other people have written books, and I've read them, but I mean, it's funny. It's sort of, yeah, you almost have to wonder if the immediate problem of this office politics really delayed him trying to do the Hollywood thing by a few years, because he was so focused on. I mean, it's all well and good to say so big deal, so another Goodman would have been his boss. Um, but if you ever worked in an office, that's not how it works. And I mean, I don't know, I didn't know Chip Goodman, so I'm totally building a fantasy scenario here. But if I was Chip Goodman and somebody made me Stan Lee's boss, I'd get that guy. I would get that guy fired so fast. I would get Stan fired so fast, because who wants Stan Lee breathing down my neck, wanting my job? You know,
Yeah.
I would do, and I would do anything and everything in my power to get Stan out. You know,
Well, of course, at the time the world wasn't so connected, and I assume um, I assume that New York and LA seemed fairly far. So, how much of it do you think Stan stayed because he was so situated in New York and he was so established in New York?
well, that's interesting. And of course, Marvel hadn't had any major success. there'd been the Marvel cartoons in the 60s, and various cartoons, but nothing really live action, right? The first live action wasn't until what, the late
Was,
70s with
was it?
Hulk and the Hulk
Yeah,
show and
Hulk
the
and Spider-Man.
Spider-Man. Yeah, I mean, he'd get laugh, anytime he'd go to meetings, you know, again, I'm probably getting some time periods mixed up here. Everybody would take a meeting with Stan Lee, because why not? He's
Yeah.
Stan, he's the guy they grew up, or at least, or even maybe even their kids grew up reading their comics. But nobody would green light. Everybody wanted to meet Stan and get his autograph. I mean, but nobody took the characters seriously, or superheroes as anything more than kid stuff. There was the Batman. There'd been the Superman show in the 50s and the Batman show in the 60s, and both those shows really treated the whole concept. It was a very kind of Mort Weisinger approach to superheroes, which worked fine in the comics. It treated as kid stuff. Have Superman, who, although you say in the preamble, can bend steel in his bare hands and change the course of mighty rivers, mostly just spends his time fighting like two-bit
Mobsters.
burglars. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously they didn't have the special effects to have him, change the course of mighty rivers. But I mean, so that was sort of the approach to superheroes. And Batman was the whole camp thing. Yeah, so but but I don't know. Look, plenty of people. I think. I mean, Stan literally was related. His cousin was the guy who directed Willy Wonka,
Yeah.
Mel Stewart. So I've heard different stories about. I think they had a little bit of a tense relationship, and I once emailed Stewart. I was gonna say before he died. And people always say I called that guy before he died. Well, yeah, I emailed Stewart. And I could see that, when I was first starting, on developing the Stan biography, and I could see he was not eager to talk about Stan Lee. This was not a topic he was particularly interested in in talking about.
Really?
Yeah. Um, so I think maybe they had, but so Stan literally had a relative who had, been successful. Uh, I mean, Stewart started out as a documentarian. He was working with David Wolf, but I just think that so I think Stan, you know, we, there's that famous New Yorker cartoon that that shows like a New Yorker's perspective of the United States, and it's kind of like, it's the ultimate cliche. It's Manhattan, and then Los Angeles, and then some other stuff in between. So no, I think it would have been a big risk. I think, I think for all those, now we look at comics and we say, well, the next step is Hollywood, because, there's been, a number of people have done it, Stan in his way, I'm thinking Jerry Conway, Howard Chaykin, I'm sure I'm forgetting a bunch of people, Brian Bendis, just a
I
bunch
mean,
of
J.M.
people,
DeMatteis.
and James DeMatteis. A bunch of people have made that leap, but but I, so in that way, it was a big leap, I think, for comics people, to think of that they were in the same ballpark as movie people, or TV people. So I think you're right. It was a big conceptual leap, that nope, who did it, and again, this is a Whitney Ellsworth, right? Didn't he do it with the Superman? He went from being the editor of
Oh yeah.
Superman to being the consultant on the Superman TV show, right? Every episode has, consulting producer or whatever. So he might have been the only one, really.
My f-
Bob Kane didn't really do it, even though he tried.
my favorite comics to Hollywood jump is James Robinson, because he's like one of the most acclaimed writers of the 90s. And
Yeah,
then he wrote the movie League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
right. Oh,
And I'm like, well, that's a that's a disparity.
I don't know who's worked that well. So I mean, why is it? I mean, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, that wasn't the worst movie ever made. I know it didn't do very well.
I think League of Extraordinary Gentlemen got to the point where Sean Connery just said, "I'm done.
Yeah.
This is it." Do
But
you realize that out of 355 pages in this book, you wrote 128 pages about the decade that was 1961 to 1970? That is
well,
36% of this book.
I I don't know if I could have done the percentages like that, but is that so? Yes, and your question is
And I just find that fascinating because 10 years of his life is 10% of his life. So
okay.
the the
You didn't do that
skew
much. Didn't do that much between like 1 and 10. That was
didn't do that much between 1 and 10. That's true. But I just think it goes to the fact that even as you're presenting the facts, and I feel like you're restraining your opinions as much, you knew that this was going to be um, the thing that a lot of readers were really going to zoom in on. And
I did know that, and I mean, look, I have to say, not the publisher that ended up with it, but one editor we approached basically said, well, if I was going to buy a book about Stan Lee, I just want it to be about 1961 to 1970.
really,
Yeah, yeah,
oh, I don't think that
yeah,
would have been cool.
you know, I guess you can. I mean, look, that's you can kind of look at it like maybe a pop musician or a professional athlete. I mean, where you have like a 10 or if you're lucky 20-year, 15 to 20-year run, and then for better or worse, you spend the rest of your life kind of talking about it, even if you go on to some other career, nobody really wants to know that much about say you know s- right, if a baseball player goes in, I think before the years of the astronomical ball player salaries, these guys would go into like soft drink distribution somehow. That seemed to be maybe because they could get meetings, because it's like, oh, here's a famous base, but the thing that everybody wants to know about is their years as a ball player. So I think um that's kind of right. That's the most. There's that 10 years, as Denny O'Neill put it. I think Denny said about 7, but let's say there's 9 or 10 years where Stan Lee could do no wrong, where every decision he made uh, worked out phenomenally well, and a lot of it had to do with the people he's collaborating with, of course, including Goodman, um, but yeah, I mean it wasn't intentional, but it's clearly the most, and it's the source of really of all the many controversies, really, right, have to do with who did what in those years. I mean, maybe you can skip ahead in this controversy about did he do enough when Kirby was trying to get his artwork back
Yeah.
from Marvel, and maybe some other cases. Um, and it's there are complexities of his life, but a lot of it is just and a lot of it just seems to be a guy going to work every day, and so and having conversations with people about stories, and trying sort of, I don't know if desperately is the word, but trying every day to come up either to sell these Marvel properties to producers and studios that had no interest in them, or to come up with something that was comparable. Uh, so I think, yeah, I'm not. So I didn't plan the book that way, but you might not. There's another book that Abraham Reisman wrote that does talk a good deal about some other aspects and later parts of his life. But even that book, and other books, there is just a lot of Stan's life that was just a guy going to work every day and having meetings. So I don't. I think the overall theme is that, or not theme, the overall thought, the overall idea is, here's a guy who over a course of 10 years was instrumental, in creating these characters and ideas that are bigger than ever today. So I mean, that's seems to me that's where what he's celebrated for, and that's what that's where the main controversies of his life come from.
And at the time, as somebody growing up in New York and consuming these comics,
Yeah.
how how well known was Stan Lee, the name, among your circle of friends?
Among the three classmates, I went to a small school, so I had like 50, classmates in my grade. Among the three or four of us who read, comics religiously, very well known. To the rest of our friends and classmates, probably had no real idea. It might have been just a vague notion, if that maybe they'd read a few comics, and I don't, no, he was not anything approaching a celebrity at all.
Did it escalate as you grew older?
Yeah. Escalate beyond those three or four people. Look, I guess the way you'd maybe know, I'm trying to think of a comparable field. Maybe like as a New York Yankees fan growing up, I know the name like Phil Linz. Phil Linz was I don't remember what position he played. He was not a superstar. He was famous for, I think, for having a fight with Yogi Berra when he was playing a harmonica on the team bus after they'd had a particularly humiliating defeat, and Yogi read him the riot act over playing the harmonica as if they'd won. So I mean, so it's just, maybe Stan had like Phil Lynn's level fame. He was like, if you were a real baseball aficionado, and especially a Yankee fan, you'd know who Phil Linz was. If you, so when I'm trying to, when would Stan, and even, I mean, this was the interesting thing about Stan Lee. Um, you go to pitch a book about Stan Lee to a publisher, you know, and he's a tricky kind of celebrity, because not every celebrity is somebody that people want to spend money or even go to the library and read a book about.
Yeah.
It may be enough just to know, oh, he's famous, but he, sometimes I see that somebody will write or it happens to everybody. You open up the newspaper, or you go online, which, since most people don't read newspapers except, people, like me, and maybe you read an article, and it's clearly, maybe for me, it's like about some modern pop star that I know the article is supposed to be important and mind blowing and revelatory and insightful, but I don't give a shit about that person, wherever it is. So it has no meaning. So I think Stan was that kind of celebrity. It wasn't like, I don't know.
It's not like John Lennon.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to think of somebody contemporary. Yeah, you're right. Not like one of the Beatles, exactly.
I'm not one of the person to talk about somebody contemporary. Lady
Yeah.
Gaga, I don't know.
Right, not like Lady Gaga, exactly. Or not like Frank Sinatra. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. So Stan's important to those who he's important to. Um, Most people, even if they go to the Marvel movie, I guess if you've seen more than three Marvel movies, you probably know that old guy, making the cameos is Stan Lee. Even, but I bet there's a lot of people who may only see one. Maybe they're sitting in the room with their kid, or watching it or whatever. Who don't have any idea. He's a weird, at a comic convention. he's a big star, right?
Yeah.
But if you, I mean, this is actually a class. Maybe this is true of a lot of kind of celebrities during a comic convention, right? If Stan Lee is walking through the hall, then he's got to have bodyguards and an entourage, and everybody goes, "Oh, there's Stan Lee! There's Stan Lee!" The same hotel the next morning at the hotel restaurant eating breakfast. No, I mean, nobody says or does anything. Maybe they're being polite, but I mean, certainly, right? If John, let's say Paul McCartney. you John came back, would be a whole other thing. But if Paul McCartney's eating breakfast in a hotel restaurant, there's got 1,000 people at least will show up within 30 seconds. Stan is not that. So he was. It's tricky. You and I, to you and me, he's a big celebrity. But probably not to like most of your family, or am I wrong?
I just
Or,
marathoned the whole MCU with my mom
wow,
by her request,
yeah.
and not once did she recognize Stan Lee,
Even though he was the same guy in
even
every.
though he was the same guy in every movie.
Wow.
It
Okay.
might be face blindness because every time Scott Lang showed up, Paul Rudd, she was asking who that was. And
Well,
I'm
he's
like,
got sort of he's handsome, but he's got sort of an everyman face, Paul Rudd. So I
yeah,
could
that's what
see
she said. He looks like a regular dude.
that. Right. That's why he's perfect for Ant-Man.
Yeah, that's true. In the 1960s, growing up in New York, hearing the Beatles come on, but also being a Jewish kid in New York, seeing Marvel get big, and then Bob Dylan. What was that like?
You're it's as if you knew my obsessions.
You quote Bob Dylan in one of these
I know, I know, I
things,
know.
and I'm like, it's interesting that even a biography is, like, that's when I realized, like, no matter how much you try to tell the story of somebody else, it'll always be filtered from the author's point
Right.
of view,
Well,
right?
and look,
Yeah.
I mean, a lecture that that I've, one of the many talks, presentation lectures, that I've thought of doing, and I may one day, is called Stan Lee, Bob Dylan, and the Denial of Authenticity. You know?
What would that be about? Aside
Well,
from
they both, I mean, in their own way, they both have similar. The people who criticize, do you follow Dylan? Dylan fandom or Dylanology at all?
yeah,
Yeah. So he's right since day one. It's been he's not really authentic. He's not a real folk singer. He's not a real blues singer. He's not really this. He's not really that. He stole these lyrics. He stole that
mhm,
melody. He contradicted himself. He's a big fake and a phone. That's you just interchange the name. Oh, Stan didn't really write those things. Those weren't his ideas. He's a
yeah,
user of people. He's just a cynical chameleon and whatever people want. Um, and it's not even that those accusations don't have some basis, but you know, there's a Dylan quote that I don't remember word for word, but basically somebody had found that in one of his albums, I think called Love and Theft. So that should have been a hint right there with the word theft in the title, that he had appropriated lyrics from a Civil War era poet. And Dylan said something, I think it was an interview, I think with Mikhail Gilmore, I think, and Dylan said something like, yeah, those if those people are so smart, let them take Henry Timrod's lyrics and make a song out of them. I mean, it was just like, so I think though that they have that in common is people are always trying to say that their accomplishments were not real and and it's all an illusion and there's somebody that they ripped off and abused and exploited, and that's the only reason they're successful. So, what was the question?
What was it like growing up and
Oh,
discovering them at the same time?
I lived. I don't think I directly, as a 10-year-old, I have to say, I lived in a very Jewish bubble. I went to a Jewish parochial school. Um, my father's business, everything my father did involved some aspect of Jewish culture or religion. You know, so although I lived in New York City in the bad old days when and it was this weird thing where yeah, I got mugged a few times, not luckily not violently, but I got robbed and so I mean, and yet I still lived in this very hermetic kind of world. Uh, so it didn't occur to me, and I was just so I didn't think about say, I mean, I didn't really even at 10, I didn't, I mean, Bob Dylan existed when I was 10, but I wasn't that wasn't what was going on in my house or it was another few years. I never, I didn't have this because my world was so Jewish, I wasn't aware that it was. In an
Oh,
odd, I mean, I was in that way that like, you know, uh, I mean, obviously I knew that people had issues with Jews and that whole, I mean, duh, anti-Semitism was and yet somehow because I was in this insular world, so I didn't, I didn't certainly with the comics, I didn't know what it was that I was responding to in the Marvel comics or the DCs before that. I just knew that uh, it spoke to me. It's only in retrospect that I wrote a book about, disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, comics, and the creation of the superhero, and that where I started thinking about it and realizing, okay, it might have been Will Eisner really that triggered that kind of um, consciousness in me that here's a guy really drawing from his background as like a poor Jewish kid running around the streets of the Bronx and Brooklyn and Manhattan. And then it became a big thing with me and one of the things that I've researched and lecture and write about. Um, I mean, and look, I think the whole, that was the period when Philip Roth and Bernard Malamud and Saul Bellow and Woody Allen, I think there was this realization, right? I mean, yeah, if you ever read Jules Pfeiffer's essay about Jerry Siegel when Jerry died, it's called the Minsk Theory of Krypton.
that Superman was Jewish?
Well, but beyond that, about Jerry, yes, but
Yeah.
not so much as it's a little more complicated. It was he wrote it the year the year that Jerry Siegel died, sort of reflection. The idea that what sort of this particular Eastern European Jewish immigrant experience, and most of these guys either were immigrants or the children of immigrants, became really universalized because it is universal. It's sort of it's very focused and very distilled and very intense. Um, but I mean that's sort of what every minority experiences, I think. I mean, I've only been Jewish. But I mean, it seems to me humans are humans. There's this common human experience that Bob Dylan and Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and uh, Facebook has a message for me. Um, I mean, that's right. Humans are humans. People have common human experience, but because of our differences, we're perceived and people are perceived and persecuted for all these things that they have no control. So, I mean, I think um, so. That was what Marvel did in a way that even that's what popular culture does. It's I mean
Speaks to you.
it speaks to
Speaks to you.
you. It goes from a particular to a universal. Um, so at age 10, I was not thinking that there was anything. I might have been I was thinking maybe some. I might have been more aware of a particular New York kind of angle to it, just because there were so many references to New York, up to and including when Doctor Doom, you know, hijacked the Baxter Building, and Kirby drove this incredible down shot, past, like, Reed, somehow Reed and Johnny are looking out the windows of this air conditioned building where the windows shouldn't open, but never mind. They're looking down, and we see the map of Manhattan Island. I mean, there couldn't have been any more, in your face than that. So I think I might have thought of it more as a New York thing, but it wasn't until I started reading Eisner, and maybe Pfeiffer's commentary on Eisner, that I really thought about the specifically Jewish elements.
Speaking of Jack Kirby, which I feel like you knew was coming.
Oh yeah, who?
So just to clear up a few things, I feel like when fans talk about Stan versus Jack, I feel like they talk about the creation of these characters, but I get the feeling from reading your book that it was more about the creation of the actual comics, like the day-to-day creation of the comics. That was the dispute until around 1976 with the copyright law. Am I mistaken? Or
Could you? I'm not. I kind of know what you mean, but I'm not. I mean, I can try to answer it based on, you know.
so I feel that when fans talk about Stan versus Jack, they're only specifically talking about the creation of the characters, the IPs. But from reading your book, I get the feeling that the dispute between the two of them was more about the creation of the comics, the day-to-day
Yeah,
business, until around 1976 with the
right.
revised copyright law, when the creation of the IP started really
Yeah.
mattering. Is
You know, here's, it's funny. Knowing we'd be having this talk tonight, of course, I've sort of, even unconsciously, started having all these thoughts about different topics I thought we would talk about, and so this is, you know a lot of people, especially with the safety of the internet, feel free to trash talk Stan. You know, um, many of them I've blocked, so probably don't even know what they're saying, because it just got, the idea of having a rational conversation with those people seemed impossible. So, but and you have a wide knowledge, so correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if there's any of those super intense Kirby, well, not Stan haters. I mean, everybody loves Kirby. How can you not love Jack Kirby? I say the most intense Stan haters have never worked in a staff position at a comic book company. You know,
or
because,
in corporate, actually,
or
I
in
would say.
corporate, um, or in many aspects of the real world. But you know, but your question, um, from inside, yet another bubble, right? Your question from inside doesn't compute, because there is no difference between creating the character and the day to day, right? It's like you're sealed in a submarine with somebody, or something. It's like,
Ah,
or even, let's say, there's, everything is connected, everything is part of the relationship. There's no, okay, it's Tuesday at 10:30, we're going to create characters from 10:30 to 11:30. It's like, holy fuck, we got to get all these comic books out, what are we going to put on the pages? I mean, that's basically, and everything stems from that.
so
So
from their points of view, there's no distinction between what I just said.
yeah, no, it's okay. Here's, I mean, it's funny. There was a period I was, I was researching, I was writing some prose fiction with the Hulk for Byron Price's company, and so I read all these tales to astonish. That what the Hulk was. All I think, yeah, I read them back to back to back, just one after the other, as opposed to having read them as a kid, once a month. And you could, and every issue had a different creative team, and usually it was Stan scripting, and Kirby was either drawing or doing the layouts, but not always. And there was Bob Powell, and there was Mike Esposito. There was no consistent, and sort of, the my joke about it was, that it would be like Friday at 5 o'clock, and people would go, "Boy, am I glad another tough week is over. I can't wait for the." Oh no, we didn't do the Hulk. Who can we get quick? Right? Because I mean, they just, they were so I think in some way that's kind of how it, they, you know, Stan, Stan did all the writing, right? And you could say, well, why do you do all the writing? Well, of course, he wanted to make the money, but you know, he went from being the editor of 75 titles a month. So if you write 10 titles out of 75, well, it's still 65 titles to give to other people. If you're only putting out 10 titles and you're writing all 10, then it's a little obvious, but must have been his arrangement with Martin. Plus, I believe that once the Marvel thing started, he really did think that he was the only one, maybe until Roy came along, who could give it that flavor that he thought it needed, So it was, partly this creative thing and partly this financial thing. But yeah, I think they were flying by the seat of their pants. I think they tried other people, but they were paying lower rates than DC, so that was, they tried people. Some of them didn't get along with Stan. Some, like, Wally Wood famously thought that, Stan was ripping him off and he didn't want to work for him. He did not thrive under the Marvel method, the Marvel system, or wasn't willing to do it, or wasn't willing to collaborate, because I do believe that, that whatever, love him or hate him, the chemistry between Stan and his main collaborators was just amazing. And I don't think any of them ever did anything that was quite as sublime as what they did together. So,
Wood might be the one exception to that.
huh?
Wally Wood might be the one exception to that for me.
There were a couple. I think Joe Orlando. It's interesting. These are like EC guys. That's funny. They were EC guys, and EC, would give. Not only would they write scripts in advance, they would literally paste the lettering down. They would pre-border the panels and paste the lettering down
Before the artwork, right?
Yeah. Because they just, they thought it'd make it faster, and it would take, and the only one who really seemed to bristle under that was Bernard Krigstein, who famously, to do that famous story, Master Race, pulled up the lettering and re-glued it.
It's one of the greatest comics of all time, so it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it seemed to work well, and he did, he's another guy, hated Stan. Yeah, he did more work for Stan than he ever did for EC. I think he did tons and tons of stories for Stan and hated him.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, look through the indexes.
Yeah.
Some very nice stuff too. I mean, some really very, very beautiful Krigstein artwork. Just all throughout this, and what I have found, and this is the people who worked for Stan for a long time, but liked him and maintained friendships with him, did get out. They might have worked for him for 10 years and done some beautiful work, but they either, I think they had other ambitions. I think specifically Jerry Robinson and and Ken Bald. These were guys who went on to do other things. Al Jaffe. These people all worked with and for Stan for 10 years. So they must have been able and maintained, some of them very close friendships with him. But I think at a certain point they realized, I got to move on, and they liked him personally. But for whatever reason, they didn't stick around. But sticking around for 10 years is still pretty good.
How do you think Stan took it anytime anybody left, considering that, he was always talking about leaving? And then
well, there were times when he talked to Carmine, I think, about coming to work at DC, to Carmine Infantino. I mean, I think that was especially when there was all that infighting going with him and Martin and Chip. he must have seen that. I mean, literally, his first year on the job, Simon and Kirby left. I mean, and depending on what story you believe, eh, they left over dispute, or nobody seems to dispute. Nobody disputes that they had a dispute with Martin Goodman about royalties, promised royalties and money. You know, whether or not, so then they were moonlighting for DC, who, a month or two later had all these covers blaring Simon and Kirby, are here. So I mean, but I guess somehow the word got to Goodman prematurely that they were doing work for DC while they were there, and Kirby always thought that Stan, who knew about it, had ratted them out. Simon, I don't think Simon believed that, and Stan always claimed it wasn't true. But literally within the first however many months of Stan being there, the whole reason he became editor was because so I think, especially in those early days, I mean, now I think it's taboo. If you work for Marvel, you can't work for DC and vice versa. But then everybody worked for everybody. I remember even in the 70s and maybe early 80s, I remember people, you know, I think Jim Shooter put a stop to it. But I remember there being like staff people at DC doing freelance work for Marvel, and maybe even vice versa. It was, it was just understood the business paid so badly, you know, that you took whatever, and the business paid badly. And it was only the very beginning of the idea that, maybe with the exception of a Simon and Kirby, or a Will Eisner, or a couple of people, the readers had, there was no brand name. The brand was the characters. There was no, there was no brand attached to the names. There might have been a brand attached. Readers might have seen a particular art style or
Yeah.
writing style, and thought it was familiar and appealed to them, but there was very little of the idea that, oh, there's a new comic by whoever out, I'm going to go get it. That was not the audience, or the way, or the way the audience made their choices about what to buy.
Yeah, that's why I was never like big into the whole Marvel versus DC. Like you can only have one or the other
Yeah,
thing, because I looked at the credits and I was like, these are the same people.
yeah. I mean, look, that was the until, and then there was Carlton, whose rates were really low, but really until until the independent era of the 80s, and especially the Image era, that was kind of that was the problem, is that there were only two places. That would be, if you happen to fall out of favor at both of them, you were in big trouble. Um, so yeah, so I don't think, um, I think what troubled Stan more than people, look, everybody likes to think they're the most charming and charismatic and talented editor. If somebody leaves, nobody likes it. But I think what really was difficult for Stan was letting people go at the different times when Marvel um, condensed. When they had different distribution crises or sales crises. There are, you know I don't know if anybody was in the bathroom with him, but there are multiple people reporting that he would fire somebody, and then go to the men's room and throw up. It just was, he wanted to be liked, so you get,
Yeah.
and he was often in a position where he could give work to people. He hated, and again, nobody likes it, but he particularly avoided, you know, that's a thing that maybe wasn't his most noble characteristic. He would often let other people do the firing.
Mhm.
It's kind of, you hear different. Mostly, you hear stories about how if an old timer came by and needed work, he would give them work. Probably as much because he needed people, but once in a while, you'd hear about him trying somebody and having to let them go, and trying to delegate that to other people.
I'm having so this has always been interesting to me. So as we know, Stan's idea of creation is that whoever came up with the idea is the creator. Um, Steve Ditko, fires back with, "Well, I drew the thing that made it
Yeah.
come alive," and so on and so forth. And Mark Evanier says, in your book that if you did it for Hollywood, you don't count as the co-creator. You don't count as a creator until you've written a pilot.
Right.
So the question there would be, well, how come in comics it doesn't end at the basic plot slash first script slash concept?
Well, uh, I'm not, because what the first is not always so clear. With this, I mean, there's been a whole brouhaha on the internet lately. I mean, 30 years later about who really created Venom. And I'm not even, I don't want to. And that was already in the era when people were conscious of keeping track of who created what, and
You're not gonna
so
tell us who you think created Venom?
no. um, um, so right, you would, yeah. What Mark Evanier says. Who came up with the idea? Okay, how do you define the idea? What does that mean?
Mm.
Right? Is the idea some, right? Is the idea Spider-Man or even Batman, right? Because people now are finding all sorts, you know, there's, if you're doing pulps and comics, right, then okay, an animal or an insect with, with a human. Okay, Spider-Man, Ant-Man, Fly-Man, Jaguar-Man. So it's not, I think the name, the name itself is not alone, is not enough. I think Stan, you know, eh, so what's an idea? What's development? It's kind of a subjective. Um, what Stan says, in his many interviews. I know he says it in that documentary, about the person who came up with the idea, but he said it many times before that. That wasn't like a big, to me, that wasn't a big revelation.
Yeah.
Um, but he said, the interviewer says to him, "What if, uh, what if the idea had failed? What if he did it with somebody else and the idea had failed?" And he says, "Then I would have come up with an idea that failed. And I would have come up with something else."
He's consistent about it.
He's pretty
Yeah.
consistent. Look, he said that so many times, that the person came up with the idea. Um, I guess he believed it. I mean, there's some things he said over the years that were clearly just to protect some kind of corporate interest. That you could sort of see that he was parroting something that probably a lawyer had coached him in. But he said that thing about the person who came up with the idea often enough that I guess he believed it. He had a unique position. He was the editor, art director, relative of the owner. He was, as I say in the book, he sort of, and I know this will send a lot of people's hackles up. But I don't even know what hackles are, but it'll send them up. He was in effect the auteur, as much as people would like to believe that Kirby or Ditko, who were fucking geniuses, and Marvel would not exist without them. I have to say that every time. Stan was the auteur simply because he was the boss. And if he didn't like a page Jack Kirby drew, he could say to Jack Kirby, redraw it. And Jack Kirby could go out to lunch and justifiably be mad and justifiably curse at Stan with his friends. And then he'd go home and redraw the friggin' page because Stanley was his boss. Was it fair? Was it right? I don't know. No, of course not. But Stanley was his boss. Hence, Stanley was the auteur of these books because anything he didn't want didn't go in those books. Sorry.
Pretty much. I love how you have to add in qualifiers because you know that the rest of the internet will be like, you have to pick one or the other. You can't have a nuanced opinion.
Exactly, and it doesn't matter what I say because no, because most people have their minds made up, and even and even though in the book and when even no matter how many times I say no, it wasn't fair, but I finish and they go, but it wasn't fair, and it's like, it's like, yeah, I know.
I'm not one who thinks Jack Kirby is undisputedly the greatest comic book artist who ever lived. And every time I say that, somebody's always like, "You're absolutely wrong." It sends me a
But
2-hour video about why I'm wrong and stuff.
and of course, then you have to define what greatest means.
Yeah, there's that too.
Yeah.
Um, what if? Wait, let's get back to Stan and Jack for a bit, because
Okay.
in Hollywood you don't credit the actor or the designer of the costume as the creator, um, or do you? I don't. I realize I
If
don't
you
know.
if you're the if you're the designer's son or wife, you probably do. You know?
But with Stan, another thing that I think people talk about is how he should have stood up to Martin for the sake of his artists and the contracts and stuff. But reading your book, I'm like, I don't think I would have done it either if I was Stan, because one, I don't even really get the impression that Martin Goodman really liked Stan. I'm not sure it would have helped.
They had boy such a complicated uh it's uh, that that's a whole book that really or a movie or something, that particular relationship. I think Martin, boy, I'm sorry to be tongue tied here. I think he liked him well enough. I just go back to a quote. You know, that, as you alluded to or even said before, a lot of the appeal subconsciously and then later consciously to me of these comics guys is that they're from the same background and generation as my parents and aunts and uncles and a lot of people I knew. So I remember, an aunt of mine was describing, I guess, some of my father's uncles. I guess they'd be my granduncles. These immigrants, Eastern European Jewish immigrants came over, you know, probably born in the 1880s, came to America in the early 1900s. And she said about them, they were very hard men. They were very tough men. And I never, and I should have, I should have asked her, I should have, and and I think Goodman was like that. I think Martin Goodman, he's a little younger. Goodman was actually born in 1908, I think. But I think he sort of, he came from nothing. He quit school at whatever 12 or 14. I think all those stories that I'd always thought were, kind of myths about him traveling riding the rails, and
Mhm.
I think he probably did that. I think and so he, I think, just was very tough. Oddly enough, he also believed very deeply in psychotherapy. He was always recommending to his staff that they should go into therapy, and even like paying for therapy. But I mean, he just so he had this kind of intellectual, sensitive side. But I think you could put him in that category. So whether, I mean, that he liked or didn't like, I think it seemed that Martin was concerned with Martin and being kind of a benevolent despot. Again, he loved to walk through his. I think I say in the book, because it's a great anecdote, or at least he loved to walk through. He had these other magazines that Mario Puzo and Bruce J. Freeman worked for, and he loved to like walk through the office and point to people and go, "Yeah, that one's got a PhD from Yale, and he's working for me on my crappy, True Romance magazines." I mean, he was, he was a tough. and you hear, like with Stan, you hear stories of incredible generosity about both of them, financially, emotionally, personally. And then you hear crazy stories of stuff that's so mean and so nasty. So did Goodman like Stan? Yeah, he probably did. But I don't think that. But I think he here's, and again, I quoted in the book, there's an article from 1972 from the New York Times magazine. And Goodman had sold the company, but he was still there. That was part of his deal. He'd sell the company, but he'd stick around for like 4 years or something to be the publisher. And Kirby, I guess they interviewed Kirby, they interviewed Goodman, they interviewed Stan. And it was shortly after Kirby had gone to DC to do the Fourth World books. And Goodman says something about Stan. Well, yeah, he's talented. He came, something like, he's my wife's cousin, and he came in as the implication being he's just some like, lucky, no talent who happened to be related, and he wrote some pretty good stories. I mean, Goodman is saying this about, he's lost Kirby and Stan, the biggest is, of course, the middle of the war about making Chip the publisher. So even after Stan has, been in charge of this line of comics that revolutionized, the business, all Stan can say is, yeah, it's a nice kid. He's a nice kid. He's like, how old is Stan in 1970? He's like 50. He's a nice kid. We brought him in as a kid, and he's my wife's cousin, and he did a pretty good job. Right?
Was young Danny Fingeroth a member of the Mary Marble Marching Society?
I was not.
Okay.
I could be a Superman of America for 10 cents, and it was a whole $1 to join the Mary Marble Marching Society. And I could have bought like 8 comics with that. So as a matter of principle, I did not join. Even though if I had the kit, it would probably be worth like, $5,000, the original kit or something. But no, I didn't. It was a matter of principle with me. Superman of America, 10 cents, and no way you're getting my $1 for that.
You'd get a theme song and everything.
I look at it now and I go, it was a pretty good deal for $1, but I was young. you know, but I learned, because comics were 12 cents, I learned the 12s multiplication table. That's my best multiplication table in my head. Don't ask me to do it. I'm sure I'll, get it wrong.
I do like, one of the things I always liked about Stan was that he was always giving his audience credit, and you mentioned it a lot in your book, that even though he was, nearing 50 and clearly not a child, he knew how to talk to kids like he was the cool uncle. And that goes all the way. There's that video he did with Will Eisner. You and I talked about it on Facebook. Like,
Right.
they start talking about what counts as art and what doesn't. Will Eisner's talking about how there's only certain things that can count as art, and it's gotta have this kind of ambition and this kind of quality and everything. And I think the example he used was the Terminator. And Stan just goes, my argument is that as long as it resonates with the people who are watching it and has a positive effect, it's art. And I like how generous Stan is about that kind of thing.
Yeah.
What do you think it is that causes those differences between the two of them?
So what was the first part of the question? Now, you quoted something about Stan. What was the
The
uh,
that he was
that he gives
always
the audience credit? That
giving the audience credit. Yeah, he didn't talk down to what they liked.
well, I think there's somewhat. I can see how you conflated those two, but I was sort of making two kind of similar, related but different points. I mean, I think the you watch a lot of kids shows, especially if you look at them as a grown up. But a lot of kids shows and a lot of children's literature and comics. They kind of talk down a little bit to kids. They just didn't seem, or they seemed like they were adults who didn't really have an understanding of what children responded to. They weren't terrible, they weren't mean or anything. Yeah, just but Stan somehow figured out that way, almost like some like a really good teacher would do, of talking to a kid. Right? If you're reading a Marvel comic, then obviously you're reading it because you want to know about what's going on behind the scenes and about the characters and now that Stan has given them personalities about the writers and artists. And boy, it's such a neat trick that he's got that same enthusiasm you do. He's as much a fan, other people have written about this too, that, you know, that he's as much a fan of the work as you are. Uh, he was very good at playing simultaneous roles. He could be right. I mean, when he talks in the third person about Stan in the letter column, it's as if he wasn't Stan the editor. It's as if he was Stan the writer, who's Jack Kirby's partner on the comics. And you go like, well, that's something. And I mean, again, you're 10-year-old or 12 years old, and of course you're not. I only realize this stuff looking back on it now. Um, and he filled the books with text. He was writing again. Whether he was writing, I think he was writing for himself. He was a he was a kid who liked to read a lot. At every meal, his mother even, I think, bought him a special stand that he could put a book on and read it while he was eating his meal. Might have indicated that maybe the family dinner table conversation wasn't wasn't that pleasant. I don't know, but uh, you know, so. And I was a kid like that. I liked a lot of text. I loved those huge word balloons, and I loved that dense, 8 and 9 point letters column and special announcements, even that predated the bullpen bulletins. So he found a way, he found a voice where he is both the person, somehow he was the person making the comics, he was a different person when he editing the comics, but he never tried to be a kid. In later years, he tried to use like hip slang, and that was painful to read. But certainly in those first 8 or 9 years, he didn't try to pretend he was 10, 12, 14, 18. He's like, I'm a middle-aged guy who knows and cares and loves this stuff as much as you do, and here's what's going on. So that's that voice. So that knowing what the readers want, and the other thing I guess was and a thing that Julie Schwartz did too. I'm not sure if anybody else at DC was really right there. You had this generation of fans who were like Roy Thomas, say Roy Thomas's age, people born in the late 30s, early 40s, who read comics as kids and maintained an interest. So even if they went on like Jerry Bales, I think the Bales had like a doctorate in geology, something, there were all these like college educated or college students writing in. And Stan was smart enough to realize, oh, look at that. I've something about what we're doing is appealing to the nostalgia buffs, which is I guess kind of how he thought of them, as well as to college students of the day, and he found a way to give that audience some kind of inside jokes and maybe more sophisticated dialogue and situations, but not lose the little kid audience who were there for the action and the soap opera. So he listened to the audience in that way. I think he listened. I think he read a lot of the letters, um, and I think he was able to combine what the intellectual, slash nostalgia readers wanted, you know, and put that in there. What it reminds me of the same era was like the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons.
Mm.
Those had a lot of stuff that they had a lot of stuff in them. They were a little more clearly satirical. That even as a kid, I understood that these were, that the plots of the Rocky and Bullwinkle were supposed to be funny, that they weren't really, so they didn't have to have that melodrama that the Marvel comics had. But he got you know, um, what, and Kirby and Ditko got, how to aim, and I'm sorry, I said that far more sarcastically than I should have. And Kirby and Ditko got, okay. You'll fix that in the editing. And Kirby and Ditko, got um, how to appeal. I mean, I think that was the thing that Ditko did not like. Ditko thought it was a weakness of Stan's. And I shouldn't pretend to speak for Steve Ditko, but my understanding from reading Ditko is that he thought that it was a weakness of Stan, that Stan should be, the creator should be leading the readers, not following them. You know,
Mm.
uh, and I think Stan didn't just follow them, but he definitely took them into account. I think he did lead them as well. But he, um, as again, as an editor, it was part of his job to know what the readership wanted and what they responded to and what they didn't.
There's definitely the type of leading where it looks like you're not leading, but you are. That's a
Yeah,
valid leadership position. In the wake of the 1966 Batman series and how Marvel, if you, because I've seen the sales charts and you talk about this particular year, 1966, a lot as well as being a turning point. I've seen the sales charts from that time, and that was when Marvel was hitting the top 20s, the top 10s.
but DC
Uh,
was still killing them.
and yeah, but DC was still up. But I think a lot of the misconceptions a lot of fans have is that when Marvel hit Fantastic Four #1, they were automatically like, bestsellers, but that wasn't really the case because they weren't really distributed that well and
Right.
and stuff.
That was a cool thing because I mean, I remember I don't remember that clearly. I do remember a friend of mine, of one of the three or four people in my class who were into comics, said there's this new thing called the Fantastic Four. You have to check it. I don't think he said check it out. That was not slang, and but yeah, it's fantastic. And I did, and the first issue I bought was Fantastic Four #4 because my friend had said there's this great new thing, and he was right.
And
So, but yeah, most people didn't know about it.
so given how 1966 was that pivotal year with Batman 1966 on the air, one would have thought that a Marvel TV show would have been automatic. Was there any do you know why that didn't happen, or is
Well,
it just not the pace that it went at the time?
that's when the cartoons started.
Yeah, but
That, but a live action. I don't. I just think that the perception was that they, right, like Superman was popular from the get go, right? And he had a radio show like within a year or 2 years of, and Batman, I think the same way. I don't think it. Not as many people were reading comics. Excuse me. Not as many people were reading comics as there were in 1938, 39, into the 40s. Yeah, but it it didn't catch on in the general culture. I don't know. I think maybe because comics were not as big. I think one of the things that got, among the many factors that contributed to comics losing some of their popularity in the 50s. So there was the Wortham stuff and the EC business, of course, but just the fact that television showed up and everybody had free entertainment in their house. I think that really was part of the equation. So even if the stigma was forgotten or backburnered in the '60s, I just think there was nothing. Television was just radio was very that's the thing that I and a lot of other historians and biographers tend to neglect that I think really uh, is important is the significance of radio, and how much people individually and as families listen to radio. I think we can't even conceive of what radio. Radio has become something else and is very influential, but it's not an entertainment medium in that same. It's not a narrative entertainment medium in that same way. that it was. So I just think comics were no longer, except for Superman and Batman, were not seen as fuel for popular culture. That would cut across family. That would be for the whole family. That it would just be for kids. And if it's just for kids, cartoons is enough. You know.
In the realm of a rising tide lifts all boats, I think one of the fascinating things about Marvel is that, yeah, okay, Stan and Steve and Jack and all of Marvel, but the more, it, it sounds like they were all hits, but when I look at them one by one, I'm like, okay, Iron Man didn't really take off until he had the red and gold, which was a Steve Ditko design.
Right.
Um, Daredevil didn't really take off until what, Gene Colan.
Probably. Yeah. And
Ant-Man, the Hulk was like, what, it lasted 6 issues, which is kind of mind-blowing,
then he came back.
and then it came back. So I think the fascinating thing about that for me is that it seems like the only instant hits were Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, and the Mighty Thor. Was,
Thor? You think Thor is that? You looked at the numbers. Was Thor a hit like that?
well, it's just, maybe not even, because Kirby wasn't even on him for
Yeah.
a lot of that first year.
I think Spider-Man, Fantastic Four.
Not the X-Men.
No, no. I don't know if I think look, Spider-Man really, I think, pretty quickly took the lead as being
The world's
more
greatest
popular.
comic magazine.
Yeah, well, being the most popular Marvel comic. What else would have been? I don't know if the Avengers. I think Spider-Man was so far and away. So 1966.
That
You
that
know,
that's my biggest irony of the Marvel age, is that as much as people like to pare it down to two names, the biggest comic was a Steve Ditko drawn comic.
I mean, it wasn't a Kirby comic,
Yeah,
or
that it wasn't a Kirby comic,
well,
right?
also, but don't forget. I mean, if you were like me and you bought them all the Marvels, I mean, I'd say I didn't buy I didn't buy the Western comics or the romance comics. So if you're just buying Marvel superhero comics, you could buy them all for like $1 a month. I mean, and that was what an incredible amount of entertainment for like 96 cents. So it wasn't. My big decision in the kid in my kid economy, was to cut out the DC comics. At a certain point, it was like I'm just an all Marvel guy. I didn't wasn't that I didn't like the DC comics. It was just I'm not made out of money. I can't be spending $2 a week on this stuff. Right? Just as it was, I'm building up a line of credit with the newsstand dealer. He's sending his leg breakers. I would do that. I would actually have okay, I owe you 36 cents. So you trust me? Okay, right.
How much of that decision was based on the quality of the books, and how much of it was the idea of a shared universe?
um, Again, it's sort of, these are things that are inseparable, probably the quality of the books. Because DC kind of had a shared universe. I mean, it wasn't very well monitored, and every
At
editorial
all.
different. Well, they had two Atlantis. No, it wasn't monitored at
That was the
all.
big
But
thing.
at least in theory, World, say there was Justice League and World's Finest, so you knew that there was some intersection, but an overlap between the characters. No, I think it was more the quality of the stories, because if it had only been if the only superhero comic Marvel ever put out was Fantastic Four, I would have kept buying Fantastic Four.
Yeah, I said that to a friend recently. I'm like, if all Stan and Jack ever did was a Fantastic Four, that's it. Their legacies are set. It's already one of the greatest comics of all time. Period.
Yeah, and people often will discount like the first 20 issues or something, and I go, you're kidding. Those are like I mean, again, maybe I read them when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, but I look back at them now and I go, that's the foundation. You don't have the Galactus trilogy without, those first 20, without the Molecule Man, without, the Infant Terrible. And, that I think what, look, what popular culture does, and Stan and Marvel did it very well. You kind of alluded in a way to it. Not every comic was great. There was a lot of crappy comics they put out. Even, I mean, there were just, stories in whatever, Human Torch or Ant-Man, or they were, and they were fun, and they were, I got my 12 cents worth of entertainment, but they weren't great, and I knew even then they weren't great. But what they did was they entertained me for 15 or 20 or 25 minutes, you know, and I knew they would try again, and I knew they, next month they'd have another, opportunity up at bat, and the Fantastic Four was coming out, and there was enough great stuff that even the stuff that wasn't great, Stan, I guess, and comics in general, you could say it's about Mort Weisinger or Julie Schwartz. Not every story is a classic, but they were all good enough to keep you coming back, and to create a forgiving audience. Like, okay, this wasn't the greatest thing I ever read, but so it's the same way. You find a TV show you like, and not every episode is terrific, but it's like, okay, they have fulfilled their end of the bargain. They have provided me with X amount of entertainment time.
Well, it's actually like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because the Marvel Cinematic Universe,
Right, that
right?
too. Yeah,
Like the Incredible Hulk wasn't a hit, but then
right.
they just take bits and pieces of that, they remix it into the whole thing.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
or
yeah.
the exact
Right.
opposite. You were gone by this point, so I don't feel bad saying it. When they killed off Ben Riley in the to end the Clone Saga, and
Ben
little
Riley.
14-year-old me was like, "Well, that's an overreaction."
And of course Ben is back, and and
Yep.
and all and all his adventures have been reprinted in ridiculously expensive omnibuses, which I shouldn't complain about. I just got a very nice check for one of those ridiculously expensive omnibuses, so keep them coming.
Small digression. I read the Clone Saga to bits and pieces as a kid, and though they are all still here, they're all like off their staples and stuff, to the point where I kind of want to buy those omnibuses.
Well, that's the thing about the. Okay, that's a whole other. Have we done the Clone Saga show
We
yet?
have done the Clone
We
Saga.
have. Okay, so then just go. Then everybody can go back to your archives and play
To,
and play the Comics Cube episode.
to summarize, it was way more successful than history likes to make it out to be.
It was successful, definitely financially and even critically too. That was I always thought it was a mistake on Marvel's part. When one point they started disowning it. I always thought, and even Stan did. I remember him making some disparaging remark in a column, and I thought, the Stan lesson is don't. The Stan lesson is, if you think that was great, wait till you see what we got coming up next. Because why would you? That's right. Why would you want to make 14-year-old Duy feel like he was wrong, or he was fooled, or why would you want to make the actual readers who liked that feel like they had made a mistake? What it just seemed like it was a very weird. Well, again, we've talked about this, but I just think the Clone Saga became a lightning rod for all the problems the entire industry was going through at the time, because people who were ordinarily rational reacted to that in ways that seemed rather off the charts to me.
I feel vindicated about it now.
You too.
I saw that Country Joe and the Fish, right? We're big fans of Marvel, and
A couple of them were Barry Melton and David Benicone in
and
particular.
Barry Melton specifically was naming Doctor Strange and the Silver Surfer. So that feels to me like a transition between the start of Marvel, when Marvel was appealing to, college kids and adults with people like Spider-Man and the Hulk, and what really seemed to be, the downswing of that time, which was when the underground comics like Crumb came up.
Right.
With Doctor Strange and the Silver Surfer, would you say that they are like that kind of midway point between, your
Yeah, I think
established heroes and
inadvertently. I mean, because again, if you've ever met or even just seen interviews with Stan or Jack or Steve, I mean, they were literally the age of and were the parents of the so-called hippie generation of the baby boomers. I mean, they were so that I think the Surfer, uh, which is a whole saga unto itself. But I think Stan saw that as his opportunity to be Shakespeare. That was
yeah.
the closest he was going to get to being Shakespeare in the comics. And Doctor Strange, I don't know. I mean, Ditko was certainly hooked into something, but I've never seen any record of Ditko, you know, trying, I mean, who the hell knows? I can't say that Steve Ditko never went to a party and somebody passed him a joint, but I have, it seems unlikely, but somehow he was in touch with that kind of vision. And you're right, because the undergrounds hadn't come out yet, and there were this generation of hippies or students or dropout, whatever you want to, you know, taking drugs and looking for something to amplify those experiences. And yeah, then the larger than life Marvel characters would have filled that need till the undergrounds took off. And I guess those two would be the most psychedelic. Although you could certainly, one could imagine an alternate universe where like maybe the Green Lantern would be considered psychedelic, or the Flash. I mean,
Yeah.
the way that Infantino. Uh, I mean, I've heard that there are some drug-like experiences that are just like Infantino's drawing the way the Flash would speed through a room. I mean, it was
I'll take your hearsay for it.
So the country down the fish, and they also, uh, I think it's just one of those. It was interesting that they came up so much in the comics. I mean, so did I'm tempted to pay like you can Peter, the movie producer who was Peter and James Taylor's friend.
But yeah, I
Got him.
don't.
Yeah, okay.
I'm
But he
trying
was
to
a
think about it, and I'm like, Salkin? No, no.
no. There's a guy who I'm embarrassed I'm blanking on his name, but he was a popular musician, like with a folk rock, like a folk duo in the '60s, and then he became a major movie producer, and now he's been sort of doing this nostalgia tour, where he's sort of gone back to his folk roots, and he plays, he'll play music, but then he'll also tell anecdotes, and I'm tempted to like pay whatever astronomical fee would be for a ticket just to go, with the Q&A, go, what about meeting Stan Lee? Because that's one of the hip things that Stan put in the bullpen bulletins about this guy. Oh, I can't believe, okay, well, the people will know, and it's in the book, and it's even it's in the Stanley universe that Roy and I did back in 2011.
I could look through the index, but
Yeah.
Peter is his
Well,
first
it wouldn't
name.
be under. It would. Yeah, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be under his. It'll come to me.
So, what do you think of the idea that Crumb and the underground movement took away from the audience of Marvel? Was that always going to happen? Or were
You think they did? I mean, is that? I mean, has anybody figured out if they did? Did they take away?
did you did
Mm,
you
No,
drop any Marvel books to get Zap or?
I dropped comics in general at a certain point, for numerous, because I was getting bored with them. I think when Marvel, you know, when Stan stepped away from doing the books regularly, And when Marvel kind of figured out their formula, combined with me becoming an older teenager and developing other interests. So I can't really, because I look back at those comics now and I go, well, they're well crafted. They're certainly, they're well done and they have all the ingredients. But for me personally, that was the beginning of a period where I wasn't really reading them. I liked the undergrounds. I didn't become obsessed with them. I became more interested in film actually, and less so in comics at that period of my life. Um, so I never had the sense that it was an either or for people. I think I was probably not unusual in that I was kind of outgrowing that phase of my life of comics in my life. Then I think a lot of people my age were, and these undergrounds for some of them came along and took them to a next level. You know,
One of the things that I latch onto when I'm reading anything
Peter
about
Asher, Peter Asher.
Peter Asher. Okay. Um, if one of the things I latch onto when I'm reading anything about history is like how much of it resonates with the modern day.
Uh-huh.
And I so one of the things that I found funny, or not haha funny, was the ad about the neo-Nazi tires and the guy who wrote in to say, if you continue doing this, I'm dropping your book. And I feel like we're seeing a lot of that today, but like at a much louder pace because of social media.
Uh, Probably. I mean, I think this was a little. This comes in the context. There's, some of your listeners, viewers, your your pod people, may
I call them cubers.
cubers. There you go. Okay, some of your cubers. By the way, just I'll throw in a plug. Nikki Wheeler Nicholson and I will be doing our own podcast. So look out,
Really?
Duy Tano. Yeah, we're gonna eat our dust. We'll probably have you on as a guest.
Happily.
um, Wait, what was I going to say?
I'll ask you
Uh,
more about that as we close.
okay, but what was so the question was about?
So it was about the guy complaining about the neo-Nazi
Oh yeah, yeah.
tires.
Okay, here's the content. So some of your cubers, I'm sure I've mentioned him. Heard of Dr. Michael Vasallo, also
Yeah.
known as Doc V. He's one of the great researchers of not just Timely and Atlas Comics, um, but of the Martin Goodman publishing um, body of work, starting from like the 1930s, up until the end. And so those Goodman magazines were really tacky, and I don't, I'm not, I, and they would advertise all the weirdest shit, just a lot of advertisements for trusses and make your own false teeth at home, and I mean just odd, that Marvel came out of that context is just amazing. That Stan Lee established, I think in part Stan was inspired by some of the more literary creative editors at Goodman's magazines, but also I think he worked it. So I spent a day at Doc V's house looking through his, some of his collection, and it was one of the most depressing days of my life. This stuff is so overwhelmingly sad. These magazines, it's hard to explain. If you ever, but you can go to his blog. His name is Michael Vasallo, Vassallo, or Doc V, and he has a blog with just a lot of fascinating material about all this stuff. But anyway, um, so you would see ads for the weirdest shit, and I think, and I'm guessing the staff didn't even, they weren't attuned to like vetting what would go through. So I think that ad went through when Goodman had sold it, but was maybe still running the place, or
Mhm.
maybe it was shortly, whatever it was, just like, but right, it was an ad for Nazi, paraphernalia, which there's a market for. It wasn't, and it wasn't endorsing Nazism. It was just saying here, you know, here's this cool, looking stuff. But yeah, somebody wrote in, and the letter got to Roy. So he said, "Why are you advertising Nazi paraphernalia?" And Roy got it to Stan, and Stan, who at that point was I guess Stan had just become publisher, and put out this edict.
He
You know,
definitely
I
was not looking at these things.
no, no,
Yeah.
nobody was. I mean, my memory of working in comics, I'm sure was like this before, and probably now. Is that you just looked at the comics, the ads were sold and designed, and you know you the printer would have like a template, like every Marvel comic of a certain month, or certainly of a certain week, but usually even of a certain month, would have ads on, the exact same ads on certain pages. And that was not the concern of editorial. Editorial's concern was the comic book pages, because you had professionals, whatever that meant at the time, selling and running the ads. So, yeah, I doubt, you know, yeah, I think it wasn't until it was called to somebody's attention, but I mean, that speaks well both of Roy and Stan, ethically and commercially. It's like, why are we running this?
Yeah.
So yeah, that was, Doc Fee, if you're out there, I have a question. I'd be curious if any other Goodman magazines or magazine management magazines in that period were running them as well.
Oh, that's true.
Because if they were selling, here, pay us X dollars and we'll run your ad in, X number of magazines. I wonder, if it was just that one that guy caught.
This was also at around the same period of time that Stan was doing, a lot of really progressive social messaging with race issues and, arguing with, in the bullpen bulletins as well, talking about bigotry, talking about that letter in Silver Surfer #7 that
Right.
was, that literally went, "I'm not a racist, but,"
But
and I think it it was really refreshing to see somebody of Stan's age at the time, like being super progressive, because there's every reason for Stan to have been like, as you've mentioned, the establishment guy. And how do you think that that was part of what resonated with the younger audience so much?
Well, needless to say, there are those who think it was a cynical, calculated, maneuver to get college students to buy Marvel comics. But and again, I was commercial enterprise, so anything he does, he's going to be thinking about. But I think that stuff came from a really sincere place. It was, um, I think if talk about this in the book, and I think you can find it on YouTube. Stan being the host of there's like a pilot,
The talk
uh,
show.
pilot of Stan being a pilot of a TV talk show where he has student radicals on, to talk about what the kids were thinking in 1968, and you can see it was Stan's real. He's not terrible at it. It's his attempt to be. I'm trying to think, almost an NPR type show, or a PBS type show, talking about the issues of the day with young people. I think he must have realized, and he himself takes some fairly progressive stands, although not as radical as the guests. I think he must have realized that he couldn't keep being the editor of these comics and then also, you know, have opinions in that way on TV. Or look, it might have just been that nobody picked up the pilot and he just went on to the next shiny object. But it seemed like he really was. But yeah, but no, nobody else was doing that. Certainly not at DC. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Jim Warren was doing it at Warren. I don't. I couldn't tell you that. But I think it came from a sincere kind of classic middle of the road liberal kind of position of the era. But sincerely felt, um, and some kind of beginning of understanding that the thing, the product he was selling was himself as much as Marvel.
Mm.
I think that somehow that was dawning on him that
That he spoke for Marvel.
he spoke for Marvel, but Marvel, boy, again, it's this neat, interesting duality. He spoke for Marvel, but he also spoke for himself because he made sure to say there was one bullpen bulletin where he says, "I don't speak for everybody. We have as varied opinions here as everybody in the rest of the country does. So I can only speak for myself." You know, and that as as great as DC's editors were, as great as Julie was and Mort was, they were not taking even mild stands on the issues of the day. I think Stan really was this interesting thing where he didn't want to just be he was the brand, but he didn't want to just be the brand. It's this very and you can just almost feel the conflict. But
Yeah.
something about him says, I'm going to put myself out there. Look, maybe in the back of his mind was, well, there's more money in liberal college students and hippies than there are in conservative. But I don't think it was that cynical. I think it might have been as simple as having a
It also
teenage
makes
daughter.
no sense.
Yeah, it might have been as simple as having a teenage daughter who maybe those were her opinions or her friend's opinions. But there was something where Stan, uh, look, Stan's first love was acting. I think he that's something that went through his all aspects of his childhood, doing things in public, you know, um, being on. He would always there was always a girl in acting. He would always claim that he was doing what he was doing because there was some girl doing it that he had a crush on or was going out with, and he followed her. But I think that makes a good story. But clearly, he want. I mean, history has taught us Stan likes being the center of attention. In a way that those other that Kirby didn't seem to, and Ditko certainly didn't seem to. So, so that push, but he wanted to be an actor. I think I even asked him. I think one of the questions was published or not, what would you have done if you hadn't been in comics? I think he said be an actor. I mean, that was, so, yeah, he was complicated and contradictory, and I guess it comes back to this is what that thing about being the auteur. I mean, yes, everything he did had to be approved by Mark Goodman, but most of the time Goodman, I think, was just content. As long as it didn't hurt sales, he was kind of content to let Stan do what he wanted. I think Goodman I think that was part of that sort of put down in that article in the Times Magazine. I think maybe he didn't at a certain point didn't like that Stan was becoming a star like that.
How much does it strike you that after writing with great power must come great responsibility in Amazing
There must
Fantasy
also come. Yeah.
number 15,
Yeah.
that line is not used again for like 180 plus issues of Amazing Spider-Man, to the point where when asked about the power of his circulation, Stan Lee says, if somebody has to have the power over the young people of today, it might as well be us. We're trying to do whatever we can to make things a little bit better. When I feel if he had been reusing that line, with great power must come great responsibility, he would have just said that line.
All right, let me nitpick you here, so you can say you've been edited by Danny Fingeroth. The
Yes.
correct quote is, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. Doesn't necessarily, which at different points has been made, different writers have made a big thing of it, because Doctor Doom has great power, and Magneto has great power. And while they may think they're acting responsibly, they're ultimately just about themselves. So there must also come as kind of a conditional, I'd have to find whoever, but that's, that is in many ways sort of not just a nitpick, there must also,
At least I remember the must.
right. So did you quote it correctly? There must also
No, I
come.
said with great power must come great responsibility. I didn't
Okay,
remember the
okay.
there.
So you were closer.
There,
Okay,
I didn't
you
remember the
left out
there
yeah.
also.
I'm probably quoting it wrong too, you know. And there's a hyphen in there, which I always did. Anyway, you know, look, you could do a Google search on that phrase, and I think Winston Churchill said a variation on it at some. You know, there are different people, some authors who it's likely Stan never read. You know, so why did it never get mentioned? It was really 180 issues.
Yeah, I
Oh,
told
you
you in
know,
a previous
actually, no.
episode, I
Well,
read all 200 issues of Amazing Spider-Man in a go, and I was keeping
well,
track of it when it was going to get mentioned again.
well, you know, part of the problem is that Spider-Man doesn't say it. It's the omniscient narrator that says it.
Yes.
So I think that might be, you know, I think somebody wrote a story where Uncle Ben says it.
In-
And so at least it's somewhere, you know, in a story with a character saying it to Peter.
Yeah.
Uh, but that might, no, I don't know if Stan never literally said it, but that was pretty much the theme of the entire series. You know, I mean,
That was another thing that I realized reading them in a binge was Uncle Ben doesn't show up as a memory like a lot for a long time. Like number 100 when he's getting his those 6 arms, his big
yeah,
vision is of George Stacy. And I'm like, I feel like this is a misstep.
Uncle Ben is a look. Uncle Ben's a plot device, as are Peter's parents. I mean, that was a thing, you know, that when I uh, was editing the books in the '90s, and we were, you know, doing that old, we need ideas. What are we gonna do? Um, I said, you know, we've never explored Peter's parents at all. Wouldn't that be something that people, you know? So that's where that, you know, love it or hate it, that's where that storyline came from. You know, was just me saying, you know, we make such a big thing of him being an orphan. And boy, I mean, look, DC, how much time did they spend going back and visiting Jor-El and Lara 5,000 times, you know, and yet we've never, you know, the problem with Peter Parker's parents was that is that if Peter was the everyman, if Peter was the, you know, the poor
Yeah.
kid, the regular guy, they had that one annual where it was established that his parents were super spies. So I think that's why nobody ever really, after that, did it. It was like, oh, that's too, you know, that takes away from Peter's, and it was tricky. You know, we had to sort of um, write, do some fancy dancing with the writing to try to make that work. I don't know if it worked or not, but you know, I just thought, here's a guy, you know, like all the best superheroes, is an orphan, you know, and yes, and May and Uncle Ben were his de facto parents, but he had real parents, you know, and whatever it was, maybe there was a lot in the news around then about adopted kids wanting to find out about their birth parents, you know, their biological parents. I don't know,
Yeah.
whatever it was, it just seemed like a natural thing for a Spider-Man story. So that's where that you know, then the writers elaborated on it, you know, but that was the initial. You know, so you see, so who created that story idea?
Right? I remember the issue in which you reintroduced Peter Parker's parents. That was Amazing Spider-Man number 365 with the
I,
hologram cover, double sized,
there
quite a
you
bit
go.
triple sized, which you mentioned in your book, but for another story altogether, which was I
Oh, the
Remember Gwen.
fan wrote, yeah, fan scripted, yeah.
And that's what was one of his last scripting jobs, I think.
You know, he lived another 25, 30 years, didn't he? I mean, I think, you know, I think he, you know, so there,
There were a few
I
after.
imagine, huh?
There were a
It's,
few after.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But
But
not a whole lot. But
but
yeah, but
that one I thought was fascinating because like I had no idea who Gwen was. And after that story, I feel like I knew everything about Gwen.
well, that was that plotted by DeFalco?
As plotted by DeFalco.
Yeah. So I mean, but you know, yeah, story plotted by DeFalco, scripted by Stan, and drawn by Romita. Yeah, you're gonna get to know those characters pretty well.
I
Romita,
have
Romita Senior. Yeah, we're closing in on 2 hours, so maybe we should.
I have a few what if questions that you can just quickly answer to close this off.
I remember your closing questions are always landmines. So let's go. What?
Does Jack Kirby stay if Cadence doesn't buy Marvel?
Wow. Does Jack Kirby stay if Goodman continues as the owner? You mean?
Yeah. Or Yeah, I guess if Goodman continues as the owner.
Wow. I got to reconstruct this. Kirby. Well, Kirby's unhappy for quite a while. Uh, Goodman. Did Goodman make him promises that yet more promises?
I
When
don't think
Kirby
so.
bought it?
He made promises to Stan and he couldn't keep
Yeah, but I
those.
think he made more promises to Kirby, or maybe Stan made them. Was
Would
Kirby?
Stan have made them for Goodman to Kirby? Like, would Goodman ever have really spoken to Kirby?
I think didn't Goodman loan? I think Goodman loaned or gave Kirby some money to make his move to California because his daughter needed to move because of her
Yeah,
health and needed a drier climate.
I think that
Um,
might have been it for.
Goodman, that's a great question, and that's the next book. I think Kirby was so mad at Goodman. I can't imagine them, at least in the beginning. Look, Kirby never wanted to return to Marvel. He hated Goodman. He hated Stan. Or at least he hated Goodman. He resented Stan. Then he, all the other doors were closed to him, and he came back in the late 50s. On the one hand, I don't think he would have chosen to speak to Goodman, but the offices were so small then. So, you know, I think I have a feeling Stan would have been his intermediary most of the time, but I don't really know.
You don't think he would have stayed regardless?
Oh, so the question, would he have stayed? No, I don't think so. You know, I think he, although although Stan was a distant cousin of Martin's, I think to Kirby they may as well have been father and son. You know,
Hmm. If Carmine Infantino was successful in getting Stan,
yeah.
would Stan and Jack have both been at DC, or would Jack have been like, "I'm just gonna go somewhere else"?
No, I think it would have been funny. Jack, you know, that probably would have been Jack might have gone back to Marvel earlier. You know? That's him. So that would have been Chip. Well, I would have been. So if Stan had gone to DC, Chip Goodman would have been the publisher. So I
Yes,
don't think. Boy, I don't know what Kirby. What year is this? Is like
like
70,
71.
71. So there was no real alternative press. Huh. And Jack. Wow. That's that's in the wow, that is a tricky one. I can't see Jack going to Carlton because their rates were so low. Maybe Jack would have gone into animation sooner.
Oh, that's true. Um, if what would you say is the fact is Stanley and Jack Kirby, Stanley the editor, we talked about how not all the books were great, but he stuck with them, and now they're all remembered as hits, or they all became hits and everything. Would you say that's something the DC editorial lacked? Because I mean, canceling the New Gods after 8 issues is like, it's like,
Well, I think there was a lot of weird stuff going on with circulation. I think we'll never know the real circulation figures of the Fourth World because I think there were a lot of you know I think a lot of those comics fell off the truck and ended up somewhere with speculators and investors and you know so the question again, if
well, like, do you
oh
think that
oh
that DC editorial just lacked that kind of vision or that kind of
no, I
patience?
think it was I think DC editorial, although as we discussed before, there people just went back and forth. I think there was something about Kirby that DC editorial thought Kirby's art was ugly.
Yeah.
No, I mean, a similar thing happened years later when Image became popular. I remember very well, all of us Marvel editors sitting looking at the Image comics going, is it the shiny paper? I mean, it was just like, I think some of us figured out, no, it's because it has that Kirby style energy and power. But I definitely, so I think DC's editors just sat with the Marvel books going, well, this is just a fluke. And whatever happened with Kirby and Jack Schiff, that famous, lawsuit they had about that space. What was that newspaper strip called? You know what I'm
Uh,
talking about?
let me see. I,
Called Space. Yeah,
I'll
I've
put it
never
up
had.
in the captions.
Okay, Jack Schiff was an editor at DC. He was one of the main editors at DC, and he was also freelance packaging a a newspaper, a science fiction newspaper strip that Kirby was drawing, and he and Kirby had an argument that literally went to court, I believe, about the percentage that Schiff was entitled to get of the revenues from that strip, and because Schiff was on staff and in a power position, it pretty much ended up getting Kirby blacklisted at DC. So Kirby, could not work there. That's one of the reasons he went back. The main reason, as I understand it, that he went back to Timely Atlas Marvel. But I think the whole attitude there, whether or not those guys personally like Jack or not, they just, I think their loyalty would be with Schiff because he was one of them, even though I think he was kind of an extreme left wing guy, so maybe that alienated some of them. But um, I think their sympathy would be with him, and I think they really felt Jack's work was ugly. That it just the thing that the power and the dynamic design and the pacing that we love about Kirby. Look, I mean, that was the home of Carmine and Gil,
Art
Gil Kane,
Swan.
Kurt Swan. So guys who were very kind of modern, almost architect. This stuff is almost architecture, and I love that stuff too. But but yeah. So I think um, there was Kirby says there's an interview when Kirby came back to Marvel. There's an interview in Marvel in Film magazine. And you could take it as just bullshit hype, where Kirby is quoted as saying, I'm glad to come back to Marvel. I feel at home with the company and the people. Well, you think, well, maybe that's just happy talk for an in-house, a PR piece in a magazine published by the company. But then you think, well, maybe Jack really felt, maybe compared to the hostile reception he was getting at DC, he did feel at least for that 5 minutes of that interview, that he was at home with the people, you know, including to some degree with Stan, who by all, I think, by most reports, including, I believe, Mark Evanier, Stan ran interference for Jack when there were other editorial voices at the company when he came back who didn't want him back or want him to do things his way, and Stan basically just said, let him do what he wants to do.
Here's my last question. So
Okay.
this is also a what if question. So I would
Do I need
like you to
to,
speculate.
do I need to get my lawyer for this one?
No, I would
Okay.
like you to speculate on what comics history and maybe history would have been like if on a fateful day in 1958, Joe Maneely had been wearing his glasses.
That is one of the toughest questions. Joe Maneely was Stan's main go-to guy before Kirby came back, and then he fell between cars on a commuter train. And thank you for that about his glasses, because a lot of people, the easy to promulgate myth is, hey, he was drunk and he fell between. But most people who knew him seem to think it was because his glasses had broken that day and he couldn't see where he was going. What would history have been like? I don't know. My guess is as good as Joe was, Marvel probably would have gone out of business by like 1962.
Okay, so theoretically, Joe Maneely lives and
Yeah.
he's Stan's main go-to guy. And then Martin Goodman says, we need you to
Well,
come up
I'm
with
being a little,
something like the
yeah.
Justice League.
Oh, yeah. Right. And this
So
Joe, I'm being a little melodramatic. I think Marvel actually had already, of course, Kirby was back. I think Marvel would have just been another Carlton or another, I think it would have stayed. I think DC would have owned the superhero thing, and I think Marvel, to be less melodramatic, Marvel probably would have kept on putting out comics like they were putting out that were middling popular, that sold, that didn't have a real identity, and that sold okay. I think without Kirby coming back, you know, Kirby came back. Now of course the question is, Manili was such a speed demon that his work seems to have been split up between Kirby, Heck, and Ditko, and maybe Dick Ayers. So yeah, I think it would have been. I think we'd be looking at it now as a kind of like EC almost, kind of like EC after their implosion, like a bunch of really well done books, and but that sold okay, but that never really went anywhere. But scholars would now be looking, of course, the question is about Marvel, would there be such a thing as comic scholarship, right? Would there, or would it just be a bunch of even older nostalgic fans, who had retired from their jobs as, as academics or whatever, and were now, in their dotage, looking back on the comics of their childhood. Not that Roy is in his dotage; he's very alive and productive and with it. So,
Is that because that as good as Joe Manili was, he was one of those classical trained guys, and therefore nothing would really distinguish him from the guys working at DC?
well,
Or
look, Kirby. There's no denying Kirby. Came up with a lot of the characters and a lot of the plots. I think Stan made them work in a much more relatable way. But Kirby's Kirby, Ditko's Ditko. Without those guys, there's more. All of those people, including Martin Goodman, are irreplaceable. It's those people. Those, as I say, I never found a cliche that I didn't want to use. It's the right people at the right place at the right time. And that's so. Manili, incredibly talented, and actually, I think pretty good friends with Stan, and was a workhorse, did tons of work in every genre, including humor. I don't know what Manili's ambitions himself would have been. I don't know if he would have, the reason all those guys pumped out so much work was because the rates were so crappy. So maybe, maybe Manili would have gone into advertising or storyboarding. There's so many what ifs in that question. But I don't think that Manili had nobody had what Kirby had. So how do you, so no, I don't think there's Marvel in that same way without Kirby coming in and doing so much.
I'll just throw in one last question because you brought it up. So I work in market research. I work with a lot of advertising agencies. Why does anyone stay in comics? given that you can make a living out of doing way fewer drawings in an ad or a script in an ad agency. Why does anyone stay in comics?
Well, we do have in comics. Of course, there was a period, say in the '90s, when sales were high and there were royalties. That's how Image started, with those guys made literally millions of dollars, and instead of just buying, mansions and yachts, they started a company. You have a lot of freedom in comics. You have freedom, even if you have a hands-on editor, you still have more freedom than if you had a Hollywood committee or an advertising client, right? And you also have an immediate gratification too. You write a screenplay, and if it gets made, and if 12 other people don't rewrite it, then maybe it comes out 5 years after you wrote it. You write and draw a comic, a month later, 6 weeks later, it's on the stand, it's on the internet. There's an immediacy in comics that's satisfying. I think everybody has their own reasons. Like Stan, I think if you become in demand and get regular work, you can delude yourself into thinking this big corporation cares about you. And then of course then there are the people, who stay, I mean, you're talking about mainstream commercial superhero
Yeah.
type comics. You're obviously not talking about independent comics or underground, you know. So, it and on a creative level, you know, it can. I mean, Marvel and DC gave a lot of artists over the years. I think fewer now, but some, contracts, for X dollars per week or per month, in exchange for X number of pages, and you get health benefits. So if you're in the groove and if you're one of the hand-picked ones, you can make a nice living, and like I said, I think it's I think it's a somewhat different skill set that's involved. But really, so I think that's why people would stay in comics. It can be very comfortable. It can really, because it's got the aspects. It's publishing. It's entertainment storytelling, but in a periodical format. So it's not like, well, I just wrote a movie and it got produced. What do I do next week? Comics now is very much like that. But say in back in the day, okay, I'm the regular artist on Amazing Spider-Man, and I could probably do this as long as I meet my deadlines and a certain minimum quality level. I could probably do this for 10 years. I mean, I think that is the appeal of comics, is that it has the illusion of being sort of like a creative regular job. And eventually, reality comes back, and in many cases bites you on the rear end. Um, and I think you should. It's always best to not just be a comic writer or artist. It's always good to be, if you're a freelancer, to be in several different fields and venues. But comics is very seductive. Again, especially if you read Spider-Man or the Hulk or whatever as a kid, and you're now working on it, you can really, it's intoxicating. And the thing about Marvel and DC is that their checks clear. That they, you know, that if you put in a voucher for X number of pages at X number of dollars, 2 weeks later or whatever, there's a check for that amount of money.
Yeah.
That for someone in a creative field, that's very unusual and very seductive. And so those are all the reasons.
Thank you, Sir Danny Fingeroth.
Boy, and once again we have blabbed forever. So hold up. So I'm still promoting the book, the Marvelous Life, the Amazing Story of Stan Lee, and I did, which is now out in paperback, and I also did recorded the audiobook. So if you're still here after 2 hours, and this voice has not scared you off, then you get 14 hours of this voice in the audiobook. So
I know somebody who bought the audiobook based on one of our interviews, and he
oh,
says that you
cool.
have a very, I think he compared you to Stan, actually. He said you have a very Stanley-like delivery.
It's very funny because I'm sure we talked about this, but I used to fool myself into thinking I didn't have a New York accent. I thought I had some kind of, I don't know.
You don't have a strong one.
Well, I guess not. Well, because I'm born and raised in Manhattan, and my parents were both people who use their voices professionally. You know, I always thought, but there have been people who said to me, I really love the audiobook, especially your New York accent, and I was like, I thought, well, I guess I have, but thank you.
It's
So thank you to
there,
your,
but it's not. It's there, but
yeah.
it's not
Well,
like.
look, I know when I say things like coffee, I know it's definitely, it's definitely there. Yeah, so buy the book, buy the audiobook, watch. I gotta say, I am impressed, you know, with just every time I see you posting a new show, that you really expanded, and you have a lot of, a great talent pool of people that you're talking to, so
It's because you guys are so responsive.
Well, as you can see, we just basically sit at our computers all day. "Oh, somebody wants to talk to us, right? I get to move my hands around, because like Stan, we all wanted to be, actors. I got some other stuff coming up that my agent's pitching around that's top secret, but I think, mainly my Jack Ruby book proposal about the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. It went from a graphic novel, now it's a book. Um,
Really?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I haven't closed the door on the graphic novel because Rick Geary is still into doing the art for it. But I decided, especially with the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy and assassination coming up in 2 years, that yeah, I've got there's more of Jack Ruby in my brain than anybody should have. But if you know, as one of my taglines has been, killing Lee Harvey Oswald was not the craziest thing Jack Ruby ever did. Um, so and I have a Bob Dylan book that I think is different from other Bob Dylan books. That that it's kind of a Dylan timeline fitting Dylan. It's not a biography because there's 100 Dylan biographies, and God bless those people who have done it. This is more of a timeline fitting Dylan into political and social and cultural history of his entire life. So those are the two big projects that I am looking for a publisher for. And
Given the
so,
nature of his life, I feel like that would be a more interesting take than a straight up biography, or the nature of his art.
oh, well, thank you. I mean, and also just there are people who are literal professional Bob Dylan biographers. It's like I'm not, you know, I'm not going to discover anything about Bob Dylan that Clinton Halen hasn't discovered. I may take what
Yeah.
Clinton Halen discovered and find a way to interpret it, because the book is not just a timeline. It's my interpretation and observations, about it as a cultural historian and commentator. And yes, Nikki Wheeler Nicholson, the granddaughter of the founder of DC Comics, and I. As soon as Nikki moves to an area where she's living in the boondocks somewhere now, but as soon as she moves to an area that has actual Wi-Fi, and she and I can do a podcast without like endless echo and reverberation, so she and I will be doing a podcast together. That again, we hope will be an insider's view of the world of comics. So those are, I'm
Awesome.
forgetting half a dozen things. But those are the big things that are happening.
I can't wait for all of those, especially your Bob
Me
Dylan
too.
book,
Oh, well,
which people in the various Bob Dylan groups I'm in will undoubtedly try to pick apart, because Bob Dylan fans hate Bob Dylan. I just realized this.
well, Bob Dylan and Stan Lee, the denial of authenticity.
It's funny because every time they're like, "Oh yeah, Bob Dylan signed, sold all of his songs." I'm like, "Why are you surprised at this?"
Right. Did you think? Yeah, exactly. Did you think he was still living on West 4th Street in a walk-up studio apartment? No, he's, for real Bob Dylan fanatics. I don't know if we discussed this. Meryl Marco, the comedy writer.
Yeah.
She has every year she posts on her website her interpretation of Bob Dylan's Christmas lights on his estate in Malibu. She writes an essay every year about the different configurations of Bob Dylan's Christmas lights. So if you,
What do you think of Bob Dylan's paintings?
I like them.
They're good, right?
Yeah, I've heard critiques. Oh, he's trying to, again, he's imitating this, but like maybe he is, but yeah, I like them, and of course, it's like it's amazing. It's amazing that I mean, right, he spends all day being Bob Dylan. So, but he uses his time very well, right? He paints, he writes songs, he makes out, he's constantly touring, and even now, coming out of COVID. There used to be an annual event in New York called the Bob Dylan Imitators Contest, which was exactly what it was, a Bob
Yeah.
Dylan Imitators Contest. And their slogan was, "He not busy being Bob is busy trying." So I think that's true. He not busy being Bob is busy trying.
think I went to a good number of concerts in the States, and the Bob Dylan concert was the one where I wasn't even paying attention to Bob. The audience was so fascinating because they were all full of like these colorful characters.
That's interesting.
So I
You
thought that
know,
was really fun.
yeah, but I'm still COVID wary enough that I did not get tickets for his upcoming shows in New York. But I wonder what I would do if somebody said to me, "Oh, I got an extra ticket." It's like, as of now. So
Not yet.
that's it. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Right.
You're.
Thank you,
All
Mr.
right.
Danny
Thank you,
Fingeroth,
Duy.
as
Oh, of
usual.
course. Thank you as usual, and you take care, stay healthy, and I will
You
talk
too.
to you soon.
Of course.